Silent Hill 2 is the psychological horror game. Even if you've never played it or been anywhere near it, you're probably at least aware of how significant of a game it was for the genre, with many horror games still biting on the ankles of what Team Silent achieved with the title. To this day, you'll find influences from Silent Hill 2 eking their way into many and most modern horror games. So, what makes a nearly 23-year-old game so special? Why does a remake of the game disconcert so many horror fans? Why has it stayed in the video game cultural zeitgeist for as long as it has? In a word, trauma. Above all else, Silent Hill 2 leverages setting and a fractured psyche to explore grief and deep-rooted trauma. Psychological hang-ups buried so far down that we must walk into the cold, lonely husk of a foggy hell in an attempt to unearth them. And everything we face, everything we do, are those sanguine reflections from our shattered mental state made into real, tangible objects we must confront and overcome. The question thus becomes, how Team Silent managed to pull off depicting that trauma. Today, we'll walk into that wet, shivering void and attempt to get close to an answer. It's time to meet in our special place. The answers you seek are there, waiting for you. Welcome to Silent Hill. Welcome to Save Room.
James, honey, did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
It feels like it's a video essayist rite of passage to write about Silent Hill 2. The problem with that is, of course, what can you say about the game that hasn't been said already? The upside is that I've got plenty of scholarship to go off of, and my goal is to effectively disseminate some of the information I've found to say something substantial about how Silent Hill 2 explores trauma. I think I've done okay in that regard. However, there's also the issue of audience. With Silent Hill 2 now the cult classic that it is, it means a large amount of the gaming population has, in some capacity, encountered the game in their past. But since it is an older title, after all, it also means there's a whole lot of people out there who've never even played it. With that in mind, I'll have to situate discussion by briefly going over the setup of Silent Hill 2. No major story spoilers though, just the bare minimum of what you need to know heading into the video. And if the pitch of Silent Hill 2 hails your curiosity, then I encourage you to get your hands on the game and play it for yourself. It truly is a game I'd consider a capital T text amidst the sea of games that are ultimately less meaningful entertainment. Silent Hill 2 begins in a run-down, grime-soaked rest stop bathroom. James Sunderland, the protagonist of the game, stares at himself in the mirror. He reaches up and touches his face that is now half covered by shadows. It's the opening shot, and already our main character is doubtful of his very existence. Is any of this real? What is he doing here? And Mary, could she really be here? He sighs in frustration. Walking out of the bathroom, we're greeted by the narration of a letter James recently received. A letter addressed to him by Mary, James's wife.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now. In our special place. Waiting for you.
The thing is, Mary died of a disease 3 years before the events of the game. The letter, our letter, couldn't possibly be written by her, right? We needed to find out. In the horizon of the rest stop overlook lies the numb, biting waters of Toluca Lake. Resting on the shores, tucked on the outskirts of the surrounding forest, is the abandoned town of Silent Hill, the place where James and Mary shared their last happy memories together. If Mary is indeed alive, and she's waiting for us at our special place, then this must be it. To reach the town, James hikes down through a path in the forest. It's nothing but dirt, trees, and the all-encompassing fog for nearly 5 minutes of game time. No horror, no dialogue, nothing. Nothing but the hailing of a town made to test James's psyche, to psychoanalyze his trauma, and the punishing horrors waiting for him to come to grips with his past. On the surface, it may seem like I'm waxing poetic about a walk in the forest with no real meaningful action or gameplay. After all, it's just a walk. But to see it through its literal sense would be a disservice to all the things yet to come. This is a game that relishes in all the ways it forces James into the mires of his past. Silent Hill doesn't just house scores of symbols and metaphors. This isn't just a horror game, but a confrontation of abuse, violence, and suppressed trauma. If there's any read we can make of this one long, winding, twisting forest road, it's that what we are playing is a descent. James is being swallowed by the enigmatic powers of Silent Hill, and the only way to let it pass judgment is to allow ourselves to succumb to that power. Eventually, James reaches a fence at the end of the dirt road. It's not the entrance to town, but instead, the back end of Toluca Graveyard. The screen fades to white. It's here you meet Angela, a grieving teenager looking for her mother, and one of Silent Hill's 4 non-playable main characters. She warns you of the dangers that lie ahead. There's something weird about the town. Something's not right. That it's not just the fog. But James, steadfast in his dedication to finding out the truth, doesn't care about the dangers and presses forward despite these warnings. From here, it's another 10-minute walk of mist, emptiness, and the repeated off-screen crunches of stalking footsteps. Again, nothing happens. Eventually, dirt turns to road. You found yourself at the end of Sanders Street. The shops are empty, the streets are deserted, there's blood on the asphalt. And up ahead are the wet, writhing bodies of monsters known as the Lying Figures. To spot them, we must hear them in the static frequencies of radio waves, and in the wailing agonies of infernal screams. We've arrived in hell. Welcome to Silent Hill. This is ostensibly the setup of the game, with a bit more veiled behind the main events of the game's story. What follows over the course of the next 10 hours are the spiraling, frequently unreal, twists and revelations about what the town of Silent Hill is, and, more importantly, what happened to the people that end up in it. What the history of James and Mary actually is. If that's enough to entice you to play Silent Hill 2, then I'd encourage you to stop here and play the game yourself. Otherwise, we press on through the horrors of Restless Dreams. James is a problematic figure, a woeful human. a shitty dude. In their podcast, Jacob Geller and Blake Hester called James a rotten person. A man who has sinned and is now swimming in the psychological torment meant to pay for those sins. Fittingly enough, the name of that podcast is called Something Rotten. And James certainly fits into that nomenclature. Scrutinizing the damaged psyche of a man with more than just a troubled past was undoubtedly at the forefront when Team Silent was first developing Silent Hill 2. Hot off their success of the original Silent Hill for the Sony PlayStation, Team Silent doubled down on the exploration of trauma by making sure each element of design reinforced the game's core thesis. Writing, sound design, cinematics, enemy types, setting. All emphasize the ways in which guilt and trauma not only linger in the mind, but are objects that must be faced in the town of Silent Hill. In an article from Inverse magazine, journalist Carly Veloci underlines how the monsters in Silent Hill 2 reflect this thesis. Writing, "There was a lot of attention put into these designs. The emphasis is put on physical form, location, and the particular monster's grand reveal in order to further not just the scares, but also the narrative. As far as Silent Hill is concerned, it's really all about the horrors that already exist within the mind and, more importantly, how to tap into that anxiety. It's important to note that Silent Hill 2 is better defined not just simply as psychological horror, but as a text situated in the genre of the Gothic, of examining the anxieties of a past that refuses to let go, and how those horrors manifest into the spaces of both physical settings and the objects that inhabit it. Online website The Gothic Novel gives us a wide but very clear definition of what we mean by Gothic setting. The setting is greatly influential in Gothic novels. It not only evokes the atmosphere of horror and dread, but also portrays the deterioration of its world. The decaying, ruined scenery implies that at one time, there was a thriving world. However, Gothic texts span across a broad spectrum. Silent Hill 2 operates on a specific subgenre within the Gothic, that of the American or the suburban Gothic. Horrors of the suburban Gothic include the troubles and anxieties found across the Everytown USA communities and familial units. Abuse, infidelity, violence, neglect, and so on. At the same time, however, depictions of the suburban Gothic also draw from certain levels of nostalgia. The white picket fence, the corner markets, the close-knit streets. Places and things the average person can point to with a degree of familiarity, with an air of fondness, a note of nostalgia. The Gothic then leverages this, uses it to feed off the horrors we've all tucked away into the recesses of our minds, hoping they've long been forgotten. In an interview with Game Anim, Takayoshi Sato, character and CGI director of both Silent Hill 1 and 2, discusses the philosophy of the design of these games, and in doing so, touches on the notion of the suburban Gothic. I made it so that the look of the town touches audiences on a deeper level, so it might be connected to my nostalgic memories, but I'm not really sure. I tried to depict a town that is desolated, filled with sorrow, yet you cannot stop loving it. I do not think humans would feel feared by seeing monsters with fangs, horns, and such typical scary visual language. I think there are two main factors that evoke fear. First, to see something beyond their understanding. Second, to see concealed their true self. I think the same rule applies no matter what kind of creature's environment you use. The concept seems enough reflected in the world of Silent Hill. Examples of the suburban Gothic are everywhere in Silent Hill 2, with each of the non-playable characters resembling a facet of neighborhood horrors. And all these characters, in some way or another, reflect both the rotten capabilities and familial anxieties James has attempted to suppress. Eddie is a bully, a kid who is capable of extreme violence and has killed both a living person and an innocent dog. Laura is an innocent child who acts as the projection of James's failure of fulfilling the role of both good father and good man. Maria, the woman who so closely resembles James's late wife Mary that she could be her twin, is the scantily dressed projection of what James thinks both femininity is and what he hoped Mary would be for him. James's subsequent sentence of watching Maria die over and over again is thus but a mere fraction of the atonement he must undergo. And Angela, who is perhaps the most tragic figure in Silent Hill 2, is a murderer, guilty of patricide, but only after suffering from an extended period of abuse by the hands of her father. If there's any character who is truly stuck in hell, it's her. But it's also the physical space, as much as the people, that enforces the horror of suppressed trauma in Silent Hill and invokes the Gothic. Apartments are dilapidated, filled with trash and suicide victims. Even the supposed exits only make way to more rooms, with the buildings pressing up against each other to the point where alleys are so thin the bricks of the buildings nearly touch one another. Historical societies, the museum of the town, house secret underground prisons, a relic of a time where executions were more than frequent in Silent Hill. And the staircases that house these secrets somehow go deep, deep, deep below the waters of Toluca Lake. But more than anything, and beyond even the borders of the town, is perhaps the biggest object of horror present in Silent Hill 2. The fog, and all the ways it licks its way beyond the screen and into the recesses of our mind. And if we want to get closer to dissecting how Silent Hill 2 uses fog to examine a damaged psyche, then we'll have to go under the hood of the console the game is played on. The PlayStation 2 was a freak of a machine, a real Frankenstein's monster of hardware pipeline permutations. In another one of my videos, I talked about the design philosophy Sony took when building the PS2's internal hardware. In short, Sony bet big on complex but open-ended design, leaving the steps for how a game was coded up to individual developers. The initial result wasn't so much design freedom as much as it was a big, notorious headache. In the end, however, it was a gamble that ultimately paid off, but only once developers grew accustomed to the hardware workflow best suited for each project. You see, hardware limitations at the time meant developers had to go through countless cycles of coding, trial, and error just to make sure a game would run the way it was supposed to. They had to figure out how to bring a game to life with as little compromises as possible to vision, but through the countless restrictions the internal processors could handle. Perhaps the biggest workaround at avoiding these limitations was the use of a specific technique that has everything to do with lighting and transparency, obscuring polygons. It was called distance fog, scattering light through a fog gradient in order to enhance the perception of distant objects, otherwise too taxing on the hardware to render shadows in real time. A visual trick, an optical illusion. In his Super Jump article called Through Mist, Light, and Darkness, writer Brandon Chin says, in the PlayStation 2 era, many games used distance fog to mask distance, cover graphical limitations, and add a sense of scale to increase claustrophobic elements. It's why Fumito Ueda's Shadow of the Colossus looks as good as it does, even on now vintage hardware. Distance, architecture, landscapes, and colossi are all blurred through mist, steam, sand, dust, and fog. As Chin notes, even through memory, Shadow of the Colossus's perceptive detail can still pierce nostalgia. Softness, blurred textures, and silhouettes still make the game look as good as it does. And while the use of this technique was certainly prevalent at this time, even outside the PS2, it also isn't the whole story. I mean it when I say the PS2 really was both a freak and a beast of a machine, able to render millions of textured particles a second through complex transparencies that seem borderline impossible. A specific processing that is essentially exclusive to the PS2. To make matters worse, the specific way the PS2 transferred data through its processors was much more complex and bizarre than any of its hardware contemporaries. And it's why HD ports of PS2 games, your Personas, Devil May Cry's, Silent Hill 2's, don't look quite the same on newer hardware. They can't emulate the magic. Over the course of several days, I researched everything I could find about the specific ways PS2 games were designed and, more specifically, how they handled effects like fog. It was a tough endeavor, with a lot of key information stemming from developer interviews, Stack Overflow forums, and programming sites that use a lot of technical jargon. It was hard to learn, but even harder to present in a way that makes sense. What follows is a basic understanding of the PS2 architecture and how it leads us to the powerful fog effects in Silent Hill 2. This is the inside of the PlayStation 2. Of all the major components, there are 3 that are integral to the way lighting effects work in PS2 games. The Emotion Engine, the custom-built central processing unit of the PS2, in charge of processing multiple instructions simultaneously. The Graphics Synthesizer, in charge of texturing, alpha transparencies, post-processing, and more. And lastly, the Vector Processing Units, the tiny components that handle many of the delegated tasks from the central CPU, freeing up memory to handle other simultaneous processes. Of the 3, it's the VPUs that prove to be the most pivotal in allowing the PS2 to handle complex lighting effects. In a video from his Coding Secrets series on YouTube, former developer and YouTuber Gaming Hut details how the VPUs handled a large chunk of the workload regarding alpha transparencies. In short, the vector units were really good at math, a process that, if left undelegated, can cause bottleneck issues at the CPU level, as any game, at any given moment, needed to be rendering several thousands, and sometimes millions, of effects. What GameHut's team discovered is that they could send specific data to the VPU from both the CPU and the graphics synthesizer, loading it with information on particles including effect type, random momentum, starting position, frame length per particle, gravity, and age. The result was mind-blowing. Millions of calculations per second suddenly freed up from the CPU. That's millions of particles rendering effects in real time. Of course, the PS2 allowed for numerous permutations in regard to the work pipeline due to the high flexibility of how workflow of the VPUs was implemented by the team. Every game handled effects differently. But again, it was also incredibly difficult to figure out. And modern hardware just isn't set up for this kind of workflow. So, when looking at modern versions of older games and questioning why they look so different, it's not that modern hardware can't do the effects like the old versions of the games, but that modern hardware just isn't made to process information the way the PS2 did, because it just isn't intuitive. That doesn't mean lighting effects in modern games don't look good. Quite the contrary, actually. But that there are different sets of limitations based on how modern hardware handles transparencies and writing textures. To put this into the final perspective, we can look at the fill rate for the PS2. In other words, how fast a console can draw pixels per second, and not how fast it can texture them or render them. Just draw. Fill rates for the PS2 are absurdly high. They're nearly comparable to the PS4 in terms of quantity. That should mean newer hardware can handle more complex lighting effects then, right? Well, it turns out higher resolution makes things more complicated. In short, the higher the resolution, the bigger the hit in performance a console takes when rendering higher fill rates. For a more in-depth overview at how older hardware compares to newer hardware, I recommend this Twitter thread by Max Krieger that breaks down the difference between PS2 and PS4 fill rates. But for the sake of time, what you need to know is that lower resolution and high fill rates allowed the PS2 to brute force its way into producing a lot of particles on screen at the same time. And due to the freak nature of how these particles were then processed, it meant that rewriting alpha transparencies at high fill rates meant access to more on-screen effects at any single given time. And if I got any of this wrong, please feel free to let me know down in the comments. So, when we look at games like Silent Hill 2 and the way Team Silent chose to use fog, we can see that the depiction of this one specific effect goes beyond hardware limitations and into a specific, very much intentional aesthetic effect. There's a shit ton of fog, and there's a rhetorical reason for it. In the end, it all goes back to that trauma. The fog in Silent Hill 2 is a mythical force unlike no other. It's dizzying, disorienting, all-encompassing. At any given moment, it fills over half the screen, racing forever forward toward our eyes, obscuring the streets, the enemies, and even James. It's almost funny how unrelenting the fog can feel while walking through it, even within the opening few minutes. Stumbling toward the dead-end tunnel of Vox Road, the stream of fog becomes so overwhelming that the mere act of walking becomes hypnotic, a ritual of despair, with the town invoking a headache beyond the edges of the screen, and the higher forces that be unclenching in their psychological grip. It's a fog so dense and disturbing that it swallows us whole until all we can see are the false projections of faces and figures our mind attempts to persuade us into believing they're waiting in the distance. Sometimes, it's the truest of horrors that are born from oblivion. In an interview from issue number 19 of PlayStation Magazine, Keiichiro Toyama, director and writer of Silent Hill, discusses the fog present in the first title and the importance of using these effects in real-time environments. The fog, which was the visual effect, the darkness, and camera that runs across the town, were all of the things that couldn't have been done in our pre-rendered environments. We thought that it would be difficult to best our competition by using only pre-renders. One of the priorities was to make the most of using real-time polygons. As a result, even though the feel may be similar, I think that we created quite a different game. Needless to say, this technique continued in Silent Hill 2, but this time, just as much as a direct aesthetic effect. James is a lost soul, a fractured human, a rotten figure forced to come to grips with the murder of his wife by his very own hand. His psyche literally can't handle the fact that he's become a man incapable of support, and thus tries to suppress that he's regressed into a vessel of violence, abuse, and manipulation. And it's the fog that reinforces this feeling of treading in the dark, of searching for emotional restoration. Through the fog, trauma is filtered through the thousands of polygons of mist and shadow. It's key to recognize that much of Silent Hill 2 is framed through fixed camera angles. Often, we're forced to stare at the front of James, and even his side, as much as his back. Even more important are the angles in which James is framed, with the camera elevated just slightly above and angled down toward the ground at a slight decline. This means that much of what we're seeing of the frame is extremely limited, with 2/3 of the screen dedicated to the cold, desolate asphalt. And for the other third, the icy nothingness of a limitless fog. Take, for instance, the boat sequence at the beginning of the third act of Silent Hill 2. After escaping Toluca prison, James emerges from the depths of the town and the depths of his mind, and enters a small wooden boat on the dock of Toluca Lake. After several hours and countless horrors, it's finally time to head to the Lakeview Hotel, to that special place. In order to get to the hotel, James has to row through the lake. He sits, and the camera shifts just enough so that James sits at the edge of the frame, with the boat taking up less than a quarter of the screen. In fact, not even the waterline is safe from environmental obfuscation, with the fog eating away at the frame until the water dissolves into the vast emptiness of wet gray nothing. Nothing happens here. You just row. Row in that nothingness. Row with nothing but the fog continuously inundating the screen from top, right, left, and center, into our eyes and into our minds. We row in search of a small, distant light that points the way toward the shore. We row and feel ourselves sublimate into that lonely, dreadful mist. It feels like we stare into the void for an uncomfortable, almost discernible amount of time. In reality, rowing toward the hotel takes no longer than 90 to 120 seconds. It's not a long or even substantial sequence. It's just rowing. But it's the position of the camera and the inundation of fog that points towards something more. James may have accepted that he is finally ready to confront what he did to Mary, to see her in the hotel, but he is still that same lost, miserable soul, incapable of truly accepting his guilt and the self-inflicted trauma. He's still lost in the fog, and we're forced to witness just how lost he really is. It's no wonder that our mind starts to manifest figures hidden in that mist throughout the bulk of the game. As a gothic setting, we're always in anticipation of facing yet another unknown horror. And through anticipation, our mind starts to fill the holes of what we expect to lie just beyond. In this way, the fog becomes a form of impressionist painting, with the specificity of Silent Hill and the things that inhabit it falling away to ambiguity. Shadows become monsters. Architecture becomes veiled in the insidious. And the fog becomes a hellish canvas, a way for James to paint himself among the horrors. What the PS2 hardware then tells us is that Silent Hill 2's fog is unique to the system, that no other piece of hardware can depict this specific type of veiled horror quite like this. And it's true, even modern hardware can't quite replicate the exact style of light and shadow obscurity. In a forum for the enhanced edition of Silent Hill 2, the PC modded version of the game, a side-by-side comparison between the enhanced edition and the PC emulated version of the game highlights key differences with how modern hardware renders the game. In short, they get close to the original, but can't do lighting and effects one-to-one. Running Silent Hill 2 full screen through emulation causes clipping of the game's environment, chunks of the void we aren't meant to see. Flashlights between the enhanced edition and the emulator are either per pixel renders or per vertex, causing discrepancies in how light should scatter across the environment. Shadows on the emulated version are left entirely up to your PC's installed graphics card, meaning there's no telling how your system renders soft and dynamic shadows. And while the amount, complexity, and locomotion of the fog between the two versions are roughly the same, and so-called visually pleasing, it's fundamentally not the same fog. As far as we're concerned, this one specific of how James's trauma is explored through fog is directly linked to the hardware that renders it. Emulation is not duplication. Original sin is trapped behind processes of vector units and graphic synthesizers. Horror in the hardware. It may be a bit overly poetic to say that light and shadow rendering play a big role in how trauma is portrayed in Silent Hill 2. But I also don't think it's a stretch to say the fog is ultimately interlinked with how we should read James. It's as much a part of him and the Gothic setting that Silent Hill attempts to situate itself in. An element of the uncanny. An object of lost despair. It's the first and last artifact of psychological torment and, through the hardware of the PS2, becomes a device unique to this version of James. Can we ever really get the same thing then from flawed copies? I don't know. So, what happens when the rhetorical device is made to give way to modernization? To modern consoles? Well, ironically, the focus on trauma can start to feel lost.
Could she really be here, waiting for me?
Later this year, the remake of Silent Hill 2, led by Bloober Team, releases on next-gen consoles. And while Bloober has commented that they want to keep this modern adaptation as faithful as possible to the original, the framing of the game through updated lenses means it's fundamentally an entirely different product. Can we really explore the same trauma if our rhetorical devices have been sacrificed for the modern-day gamer? I'm not so sure. Based on extended trailers, gameplay for Silent Hill 2 Remake is entirely reworked. The camera is no longer fixed angle depending on the location, but defaulted behind James's back and free to orbit as the player wishes. Common practice for any and all mass-market third-person titles. You're now free to look around the setting and free to move the horizon wherever you please. Scene framing is now thrown away. This, of course, means that visibility is changed for the next generation. Streets are a bit brighter, and you can see the shapes of cars and buildings from farther away. Moving in physical space is made easier on the eyes and on the sticks. This then means that the object of horror in the new Silent Hill 2 has fundamentally changed. No longer is the setting used to leverage a focus on trauma analysis, but instead, on the physical horrors we find through the monsters and the overused tropes that come with engaging in horror in this type of way. Take, for example, this scene from the latest gameplay trailer of one of the upper levels of the hospital section. What was once a simple, parasitic horror of the eerie by making James use a strand of hair to reach an object in the drain of a shower is now relegated to the simplistic horror of a jump scare. Behind you, a monster yells, a window breaks, the music gets loud, and the camera moves fast. Unease of the unreal from the original game is now dissolved into generic action combat. It isn't classy, or provocative, or subtle, but instead, the cheapest tool available at Bloober's disposal. A lower brow philosophy of what horror should be. It's no wonder then that the trailer begins with the line, "The fog-shrouded town of Silent Hill, like you've never seen it before." Of course it isn't. the horror has changed. It's not the same town, and it's not the same fog. It's replication of trauma without substance, and to no avail. This isn't to say the new Silent Hill will completely miss the mark. The jury is still out on whether or not Bloober will succeed on that front later this fall. But instead, that the means for how trauma is explored in Silent Hill, in my opinion, is directly tied to how setting is not just interacted with, but forefronted to the point that it becomes a part of how the game itself is characterized. The particle effects that bring the sheer density of the fog to life is perhaps one of the most essential objects for how trauma is invoked within the setting of Silent Hill. And it's clear that without the technical prowess of how the PlayStation 2 rendered these types of effects, that the mode of how trauma is thus explored in the game would have been impossible to illustrate. Without the PS2, there is no hyper-dense, hypnotic, unnerving fog. Without fog, there is no exploration of deep-rooted psychological torment. Without fog, there is no manifestation of trauma. Without fog, there is no Silent Hill 2. Let me know what you think of Silent Hill 2. Is the fog actually as important to the exploration of trauma as I've made it out to be? And are you excited for the remake from Bloober Team later this year? I know I am, but maybe not for the reasons you'd expect. I just need to know. Until next time, my name is Christian, this is Save Room, and we'll see you in the next one.